Well, welcome back to part 2 of our lesson on biblical geography. We've been looking at the land of Israel, and we're going to look and see how this small land has a great deal of contrast, even in this very small place. In terms of size, if we were to compare Israel to the United States, we would see that it's pretty small. If we were to compare it to China, quite small as well. Compared with the nation of India, very small. In fact, wouldn't even be as big as some of the states in India. So Israel really is a rather small place. But it's a very diverse place. We have contrasts in terms of elevation. We have Mount Hermon, a high place, almost 3,000 meters, high enough to have snow on its peak throughout the year. So it's cold there, pretty wet at that high elevation. There's even a ski resort there that the Israelis like to have fun and ski there. Well, as we see, with Mount Hermon in the north, and as we go down to the Rift Valley or the Jordan Valley, which is the lowest place on the face of the earth, the shore of the Dead Sea is minus 400 meters. And it's the lowest point on the face of the earth. And because of that, it can be very hot and dry there. So we have Mount Hermon, which is high, and the shore of the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on land anywhere on the planet. And sometimes when the level of the Dead Sea goes down, we have these naturally forming salt crystal formations. Okay, let's look at contrast in terms of temperature. As we mentioned, up at Mount Hermon, because of the high elevation, the temperatures are cooler, in fact, cold enough that snow is there year-round, so quite cold. In fact, Jerusalem, which is not as high as Mount Hermon, but still 750 meters high, occasionally there'll be snow in the wintertime in Jerusalem, so it can get rather cold. But if we were to go down to the Jordan Valley, to Jericho, there the temperatures would be quite hot. Maybe up to 40, 45, 50 degrees Celsius because of the low elevation. Remember, this is the lowest point on the face of the earth. So high elevations have cooler temperatures, low elevations have higher temperatures. And so the area around Jericho has palm trees. In fact, if you're near the Dead Sea, sometimes you can see caravans of camels going by. Well, there's contrast in terms of the fertility of the land. Up north in Galilee, where there's more rainfall, and where the soil has eroded down into the valleys are quite fertile, and there are many places where farmers can grow crops there. In fact, farther north in the Hula Valley, which is the Jordan Valley north of the Sea of Galilee. This area used to be swampy, but they've drained it, and it is extremely fertile. They get many harvests a year from the Hula Valley in the extreme northern part. In fact, you can see Mount Hermon with its snow at its peak in the background. So just at the foot of Mount Hermon. But if we were to travel to the south, place called the Negev, which literally means south in Hebrew, there nothing grows. There's no trees, there's no bushes, no grass, and certainly farmers can't grow any crops because there's just not enough rainfall. It's just not fertile, and so we don't see any cultivation of crops in the southern part of Israel. Well, let's look at rainfall, the contrast there, and the availability of water. We mentioned that Mount Hermon in the north has snow, and so that's the main source of water for all of Israel, even to this day, because that snow will melt, flow down, go into the Sea of Galilee, then goes down by the Jordan River to the Dead Sea, and so that's the main source of water for Israel. As we look at this rainfall map, we can see the pink areas near Mount Hermon. That's the area of highest rainfall. But as we move to the east, we see that things dry out quite quickly. Rainfall decreases. And as we move south, rainfall decreases as well. So as we read the story of when Sarah wanted to drive out Hagar, there was some jealousy going on there. Abraham was sad, he was reluctant, because he knew that driving her out in this area was a death sentence. If she didn't know where the wells were located, the climate there is hot and dry, very little vegetation, and in fact that's what happened. They were at the point of death, Hagar and Ishmael, when God intervened. So the southern area is very, very dry. Let's look at the importance of the geographical setting. We're going to flip to the New Testament at this point and look at the story of the woman at the well, John 4, 5 through 7. So we came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son, Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about the 6th hour. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" Well, here's the setting of that. They're at Jacob's well. The traditional spot is right there at the foot of Mount Gerizim. She was from Sychar, which would be on the right in this picture. And on Mount Gerizim used to be a temple. And so they got into a dialogue about where is the proper place to worship. And she says, is it here where our ancestors had a temple? Actually, about 100 years earlier, that temple on top of Mount Gerizim, that Samaritan temple, was destroyed by the Jews. Okay, you know there's a lot of animosity between the Jews and the Samaritans. And so she wanted to engage Jesus in this debate about the proper place to worship. You can see the remains in the foreground of this picture of the Samaritan temple on top of Mount Gerizim. In fact, some of the steps to that temple exist to this day. So you can picture this dialogue going on. They're at the well. She's from Sychar. Mount Gerizim is plainly in view. They could look up and see that temple. And so she goes after the discussion with Jesus to tell people in her village that she's found the Messiah. So just knowing the geographical background adds a lot of flavor to that story. It helps us to visualize it better. Well, let's review. We talked about Israel as a land between. A land between. It's a land between 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And it's a land between 2 superpowers of the ancient world. Those in Mesopotamia, like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and then down in the southwest, Egypt. And these superpowers would often fight against each other, and as they would go down to destroy the other, they would have to pass through Israel. God wanted His people to develop faith. Faith is very, very important to our Lord. And so, the people of Israel needed God's protection because they lived right on the highway, right on the way for these marching armies going to conquer the other superpower. And so usually what would happen along the way, that they would subdue the nations on that route so that they could get supplies and tribute, and so Israel would suffer accordingly if they didn't have God's protection. And we saw that Israel's a land of faith in terms of provision of food, daily bread. They were dependent on the Lord for rainfall. No rain meant no harvest, no food. Whereas in Egypt and up in Mesopotamia with those rivers, there was pretty much an assurance that there would be water for their crops year-round. But Israel had to depend on the Lord for their daily bread.